Take you back to one of the most devastating natural disasters we've had in many years in our country, the flooding down in KZN and, of course, the Eastern Cape, but KZN specifically. Business Leadership South Africa's CEO, Busi Mavuso, has welcomed the release of the Auditor-General's report on the flood relief funds. You remember how concerned many citizens were that all that money was going to simply vanish and be misappropriated and not used for what it was meant for. Well, let's speak to Busi Mavuso, joining us now, BLSA CEO this afternoon here on Today. So, Busi, good afternoon to you. Appreciate your time. So, you're happy with the Auditor-General's report, although it doesn't paint a very good picture. Too slow was the reaction from local government across the board. What's your reaction to the report?
Gareth, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I absolutely agree. The report was or rather the response of government in dealing with the crisis, humanitarian crisis that the KZN and Eastern Cape people have actually faced was rather too slow. I think the concern that is actually emanating, and I think it's definitely a common thread throughout the whole of government, it is the incapability of government to deliver as and when required. I mean, issues are being raised, Gareth, as well, around the quality of the work that has been done by government in as far as this is concerned. On this one, I would have thought that with all the noises that were actually there around government ensuring that the relief funds that are going to go to KZN and Eastern Cape are spent wisely and are spent on intended purposes, I would have thought that more precautionary measures or special precautionary measures should have been taken to ensure that we do a more decent job than what we usually do. And I mean, these are human lives that have been affected. I mean, the government apparently undertook to build about 1,810 units. Not even 40% of that was delivered. So I think I worry about this notion of a capable state, around how we are actually going to achieve, the economic recovery agenda that we'd actually like to achieve as a country. So I think the president keeps on talking about the professionalization of the public service. It is a narrative that is out there in government, but on the ground, where it matters, where the rubber hits the road, it doesn't look like, that is actually happening. And I think it continues to be a concern, Gareth.
Yeah, quite rightly as well, Busi. I'm also speaking to Sihle Zikalala, the MEC, KZN MEC, obviously, of course, former Premier of the KZN province, at 4:15 this afternoon to actually get a reaction from him as well. But what concerns, I think, a lot of people, and tell me if you agree or not, is we've always heard from government that in situations, if the money was readily available, if it was put to good use quickly, that government would be able to do anything. It always comes down to a financial issue. But as you just alluded to now, the money was there. It wasn't spent well. Sometimes it wasn't spent at all. And when it was spent, the quality of the workmanship was so bad that it was almost inhabitable, some of these houses. So it's not about money, is it, Busi? It's the fact that government can't get it right, even with a blank check.
It's not about money, and I think it is concerning if you're going to get such responses from government, because at the very least, the decent thing for government to do would be to actually acknowledge where there's been failures in the system, where there's been weaknesses in the system, where there's been gaps in the system. So when they continue ducking and diving the way they're doing, it's concerning. It's concerning because it says, this is not a government that is ready to take accountability. This is not a government that is ready to actually be responsible. It says that when such a crisis happens again, South Africans should not expect anything different from a delivery perspective from government. I mean, this is not just about this particular issue. It even extends to the municipalities. This is exactly the same thing that we see at the municipalities. So what then becomes the excuse of government where you have dysfunctional municipalities who are failing to actually provide basic services, and public goods, that they're constitutionally bound to actually provide, because then municipalities get allocation. So the issue at municipality as well is not money. I mean, you're sitting in a situation, Gareth, where some of the municipalities end up giving the money back to treasury, money that is meant for infrastructure investment, for maintenance of the infrastructure, it ends up being given back to Treasury because it has not been spent.
Yeah.
And you probably maybe look at it and say, is this the reason, why we actually set with this situation in KZN and the Eastern Cape? Is it because you don't have capable people in government who have not been doing their work in as far as infrastructure maintenance, building, and whatever the case is concerned, and therefore you set, with an environment that was therefore susceptible, to the floods, and we saw people's lives being lost, because people who were actually employed to do the job failed to do the job. It's an issue of an incapable state. It's an issue of cadre deployment. It's an issue of not having the right people in the jobs. It's an issue of urgently needing to professionalize the public service. It's an issue of nepotism, that continues to be reported at municipal level, at local government level. And I think when so many lives have been lost, the decent thing to do for government going forward is to look at how we actually expedite and accelerate the issue of the professionalization of the public service, because these lives, maybe, if government officials had done their work in terms of infrastructure maintenance, they wouldn't have been lost. And those that were affected didn't have to go through this entire situation when they've already lost their loved ones and their homes, where government still fails to deliver, and people continue to be subjected to living to inhumane conditions.
Well, you'll know as a CEO as well that, on the face of it, if you return money back to your CFO, your financial department that you haven't spent, it means you failed. You have not fulfilled your mandate. It's not a good thing to return the money. Maybe it's time for government to start acting more like a business and stop acting like a government. Some are suggesting as well. Busi, before I say goodbye to you as well, this does talk to a leadership vacuum, crisis management, a failure as far as government is concerned. Speak to me about how a business leader, perhaps like yourself, perhaps those you deal with, would have handled something like this. Lessons for government to take away, because this was not handled well. It's my last question to you briefly, if at all possible.
Gareth, this is a failure of planning. I think we speak about ESCOM today and say that Medupi and Kusile were actually victims of a failure of planning. And when you speak to ESCOM people, they will tell you that planning was disastrous. Some will even tell you that it was actually non-existent. So you are hit with a crisis like this. Was proper planning done? Was proper analysis done? Did we know what interventions we needed to put in place when? Did we know, how many people we actually needed to cater for? Did we have some form of a project plan and probably maybe a PMO office that was charged to ensure that they deal with making sure that these people that were actually affected, their lives are restored back to some semblance of normalcy as quickly as possible. And if you ask me the question, I would say there was no planning that was done. They probably maybe got whatever service providers, and I'm sure half of that money ended up in brown envelopes.
Busi, forgive me, I'm going to have to just come in very quickly, Busi. I'm sure you'll forgive me. I'll tell you why. Busi Mavuso, BLSA CEO, the parents of the teenagers who died at the Enyobeni Tavern have just come out to speak to Viwe Mtila. But Busi, I'm sure, understands very well. We need to go to that, but I appreciate your time this afternoon.